Human and alien girl flee a city under siege, but find that the real enemy is not who they expected. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main characters. The city was in chaos. Buildings crumbled as explosions echoed through the streets, sending dust and debris into the air. The once bustling metropolis, a symbol of civilization and progress, was now nothing more than a war zone. At the heart of it all was Jake Matthews, a soldier who had seen his fair share of battles. But this was different. The enemy wasn't what he had expected. He had been stationed here to defend the city against a hostile force from a neighboring star system, but something was off. The invaders weren't just looking to conquer, they were tearing apart everything in their path, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. Jake ran through the crumbling streets, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to find her. Lyanna, the alien girl he had been tasked with protecting, was still out there, somewhere in the city, and he couldn't afford to lose her. The wind whipped around him, carrying the scent of burning metal and scorched earth. The city's defenses had failed, and the enemy was closing in. Jake's boots hit the cracked pavement as he sprinted toward the last known location of Lyanna, hoping against hope that she was still alive. Lyanna, with her glowing purple eyes and green skin, was unlike anyone Jake had ever met. She had arrived on Earth as part of an intergalactic peace mission, but now, she was in the middle of a war she never asked for. Her race, the Illyrians, were known for their peaceful ways and advanced technology, but even they weren't immune to the chaos of this brutal conflict. As Jake turned a corner, he spotted her, Lyanna, standing at the edge of a broken building, her figure silhouetted against the smoke-filled sky. She looked as though she had been through hell, her body covered in dirt and her usual calm demeanor replaced with a look of determination and fear. She saw him too, her eyes widening as she recognized him. Without a word, she ran toward him, her feet barely touching the ground. Jake reached out to grab her arm, pulling her into the relative safety of a nearby alley. "We need to go now," he said, his voice low but urgent. Lyanna nodded, her face pale but resolute. Together, they began to move through the alley, staying as quiet as possible, knowing that any sound could give them away. They didn't know what was waiting for them outside the city, but it had to be better than what was happening inside. As they moved, Jake couldn't help but feel a strange bond between them. Lyanna was different from the others, her strength and grace beyond anything he had ever seen in a human. But it was more than that. It was her spirit, her unwavering determination to survive, that made her stand out. They reached a broken-down vehicle, one of the few left in the city that still worked. Jake jumped in the driver's seat and started the engine. Lyanna climbed in beside him, her eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of danger. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chaos. Jake glanced at her, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Anywhere but here," he said, his foot pressing harder on the gas pedal as they sped through the city's deserted streets, leaving the destruction behind them. But as they reached the outskirts, Jake realized something that made his blood run cold. The real enemy wasn't the invaders. It was something far more dangerous, lurking just beneath the surface of the conflict. And it was closing in on them fast. The engine of the vehicle hummed steadily as Jake and Lyanna sped away from the city, the smoke and chaos fading behind them. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual bustling life of the metropolis now replaced by an unsettling calm. Jake's grip on the steering wheel tightened as his eyes darted to the rearview mirror, scanning for any sign of pursuit. Lyanna sat next to him, her gaze fixed on the horizon, her expression unreadable. "Where exactly are we going?" she asked again, her voice steady but tinged with a hint of uncertainty. Jake glanced at her, his jaw clenched. "I don't know. Somewhere safe. We need to get out of this area before they realize we're gone. The hum of the engine and the soft sound of tires on the cracked pavement were the only noises breaking the silence in the vehicle. Outside, the world seemed to stretch endlessly, a vast expanse of desolation. They were heading toward the outskirts, toward the unknown, away from the city that had been their home for so long. Jake had always known there were dangers lurking in the galaxy, but this was different. There was something about this invasion that didn't add up, and it gnawed at him. They had expected an enemy to come and conquer, but instead, what they had found was far more insidious. Jake shook his head, trying to push the thought away. He had to focus on getting Lionel to safety, and everything else could wait. "We'll figure it out," he muttered more to himself than to her. Lionel shifted in her seat, her eyes narrowing as she studied the landscape. "Jake," she said quietly, "we're not being followed. At least not directly." Jake didn't need to ask how she knew. Lionel's heightened senses, a gift from her alien heritage, were far beyond anything he could comprehend. She had a way of sensing things, reading the environment with an ease that still amazed him. "I don't like this," she continued, her voice barely a whisper. "Something feels wrong." Jake didn't respond immediately. He had felt it too, that same nagging sensation in the back of his mind. Something was off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. The calm was too quiet, too perfect. No pursuit, no signs of the enemy. He glanced at Lionel, catching the faintest glint of worry in her eyes. She wasn't one to show fear, but she was far from invincible. In her world, peace and safety were foreign concepts, and yet, here she was, trusting him to keep her safe. He couldn't afford to let her down. As they drove further away from the city, the landscape grew more barren. The road stretched out ahead of them, leading them into a vast, empty wasteland. Jake's mind wandered as he drove, memories of the battles he had fought, the comrades he had lost, and the life he had left behind. All of that felt like it was slipping further away with each mile they put between themselves and the city. But what awaited them? Lionel's presence beside him was a constant reminder of the stakes. Her kind was not built for war, and yet here she was, a reluctant survivor. She had been caught in the crossfire of a battle she never signed up for, just like him. They were both trying to outrun the chaos, but for how long? Jake's eyes scanned the road ahead, searching for any sign of danger. But it wasn't just the enemy he had to worry about now. It was something deeper, something far more dangerous. And as the sun began to set, casting an orange glow across the desolate landscape, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the real enemy wasn't who they had expected at all. The wasteland stretched out in front of them, an endless expanse of cracked earth and dust. Jake's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he drove, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, casting a dim orange light across the barren land. It felt like they were the last living souls on Earth, alone in a world that had fallen apart. Lionel sat beside him, her green skin glowing faintly in the fading light. Her purple eyes were locked on the road ahead, but there was a distant look in them, as though her mind was somewhere far away. Jake glanced at her, wondering what was going through her head. She had been through so much, more than anyone should have to endure. Her race, the Ilarians, had always been peaceful, and yet here she was, fighting for survival on a planet that was anything but peaceful. How much further? Lionel's voice broke through his thoughts. Jake didn't have an exact answer. Not much farther. We'll reach the shelter before nightfall. It was a lie. He didn't know if they would reach the shelter before nightfall, or if the shelter would even be safe. But it was all he could offer her. Lionel nodded, her expression unreadable. She had come to trust him, but there was a weariness in her that Jake couldn't ignore. She had seen the worst of what humanity and other alien species could offer, and yet, she still stood strong. He admired her strength, but at the same time, he felt guilty. He wasn't sure how long they could keep running, or if they could outrun what was coming. The feeling of being hunted, always looking over his shoulder, had been gnawing at him since the invasion began. They were no longer just running from the enemy, they were running from everything. The world as they knew it was collapsing, and there was no way to escape the consequences. Jake didn't say anything more, focusing instead on the road ahead. He kept the vehicle at a steady pace, careful not to draw attention to themselves. The last thing they needed was to be discovered by the enemy. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped, and Jake flipped on the vehicle's heater, trying to keep the chill at bay. Lioness shivered slightly, and Jake shot a quick glance at her. "Are you okay?" he asked. She nodded, though her lips were slightly blue. "I'll be fine," she replied, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. Jake could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on them. They had no choice but to keep moving. They couldn't stop, not yet. The shelter was still miles away, and they didn't have the luxury of waiting for the morning. As they drove on, the silence between them grew more comfortable, more familiar. They had spent so much time together now, in the midst of chaos, that the silence felt like a kind of unspoken understanding. Lionel's presence beside him, steady and calm, was a reminder of what he was fighting for. She wasn't just an alien to him. She was a person, someone who had shown him a strength he hadn't known he needed. They had formed a bond, one that transcended species, and for the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he wasn't alone. "Jake," Lioness said suddenly, her voice soft but urgent. "I think we're being followed." Jake's heart skipped a beat, and his hand instinctively moved to the gearshift. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low. Lioness' eyes flickered to the rearview mirror. "I can't be certain, but I feel it. Something's not right." Jake's pulse quickened. The weight of the situation was beginning to settle in once again. They had to keep moving, but they also had to be smart. He knew they couldn't afford to make a mistake. He glanced at Lioness, her face tense but focused. She was right. Something was wrong. "Hold on," Jake muttered under his breath, pressing the gas pedal harder. The vehicle surged forward, and Lioness held on as the world outside blurred. The real enemy wasn't just the one they had seen on the battlefield. The true danger was the unknown, the things they couldn't see or anticipate. And it was closing in on them fast. The vehicle bounced over uneven terrain, the low rumble of the engine the only sound between Jake and Lioness. The night air was cold, and the stars above were barely visible through the haze of smoke still rising from the city they had left behind. Jake kept his eyes focused on the road, his grip firm on the steering wheel as his thoughts raced. Something was wrong. Lioness had sensed it first, but now Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced at her, but she was staring straight ahead, her face illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard. Her violet eyes were narrowed, her expression unreadable. She had always been composed, but tonight, there was something different in her. "We need to be ready," she said quietly, breaking the silence. Jake glanced at her, his heart skipping a beat. "Ready for what?" "For whatever's coming," she replied. Jake nodded, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy cloak. The vehicle's headlights cut through the darkness, but the road ahead seemed endless, stretching out into the void. They were heading into unknown territory, and every minute that passed felt like they were being pulled deeper into a trap they couldn't escape. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. "Do you feel it?" Lioness asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake's brow furrowed as he focused on the road, but he didn't respond. He knew exactly what she meant. The air felt thick with tension, charged with something he couldn't quite place. "I think we're close," she added, her voice steadier now. Jake didn't answer. They had to keep moving. They couldn't afford to stop. As the night wore on, the silence between them deepened, but the unease in the air only grew stronger. Jake had been a soldier long enough to know when something was off, and tonight, everything felt off. His instincts told him they were being hunted, but by who? He couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that they weren't just running from the enemy they had been fighting, there was something else out there, something far more dangerous, and it was closing in. The vehicle's wheels kicked up dust as they rounded a bend, and Jake's heart rate quickened. The landscape was changing. What had once been flat and barren was now dotted with jagged rocks, an ominous silhouette against the dark sky. A small outpost came into view, nestled at the base of a rocky hill. It was their destination, or at least, it was supposed to be. Jake slowed the vehicle as they approached the outpost, the only signs of life a flickering light from inside the building. He didn't like it. Something about this place felt off. Lionel's sharp intake of breath confirmed his suspicions. "It's not what I expected," she murmured. Jake didn't respond, but his hand instinctively moved to the sidearm at his hip. They had to be careful. The last thing they needed was to walk into a trap. He brought the vehicle to a stop in front of the outpost and turned off the engine. The eerie silence that followed felt suffocating. Jake glanced at Lionel, who was already looking out the window, her eyes scanning the surroundings. She could sense something he couldn't. He trusted her instincts. "Stay alert," he said softly. "We don't know what we're walking into." Lionel nodded, her expression calm but focused. Together, they stepped out of the vehicle, the gravel crunching beneath their boots. The cool night air was a sharp contrast to the heat of the city they had fled. Jake's eyes swept the outpost, taking in the dimly lit building and the surrounding area. It looked abandoned, but there was something about the place that made him uneasy. "Let's get inside," he said, his voice low. They moved toward the door, Jake leading the way. As he reached for the handle, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Something wasn't right. The door creaked open, and they stepped inside, the stale air of the building enveloping them. The room was dimly lit, and the walls were lined with strange markings Jake couldn't make out. It was a relic of another time, and Jake had a sinking feeling that it was hiding something that could change everything. Lionel's voice broke the silence. "This isn't just a shelter, is it?" she asked, her tone laced with concern. Jake didn't answer immediately. He was too busy trying to piece together what he was seeing. The place felt like it had been untouched for years, but there was a presence here, something lingering in the shadows. "No," he said quietly. "This is more than that." The door slammed shut behind them, and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. The real enemy wasn't just outside. It was here, hidden in the dark, waiting for them to make the wrong move. The door slammed shut behind them with a heavy thud, sealing them inside the dimly lit room. Jake's heart was pounding in his chest, the silence pressing in on him from all sides. He reached instinctively for the sidearm at his waist, fingers brushing the cool metal. The room around them felt ancient, the air stale and thick with the scent of long-forgotten dust. Lionel stood beside him, her body tense, her violet eyes scanning the space with a wariness that matched his own. She was quiet, as if listening for something just beyond their reach. "This place gives me the creeps," Jake muttered, his voice low. Lionel didn't respond immediately, her focus still sharp, but her lips parted slightly, as if contemplating her next words. "It's not just the place, Jake," she said softly, her voice steady but tinged with a hint of unease. "It's what it's hiding." Jake shot her a quick glance, his pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" She tilted her head slightly, her alien features framed by the faint light. "There's something in here. Something we're not meant to find." Jake's grip tightened on the handle of his sidearm. He wasn't sure what she meant, but he trusted her instincts. They had kept them alive this long. They needed to be careful. Every move they made felt like it could trigger something, and the silence that enveloped them only added to the feeling of being watched. "Let's keep moving," Jake said, keeping his voice low. "We'll find out what's going on here, but we can't waste time." Lionel nodded, her gaze never leaving the shadows of the room. Together, they moved deeper into the structure, the faint sound of their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The deeper they went, the colder the air became. It was as if the building itself was alive, breathing with a quiet, ominous pulse. The corridors twisted and turned, leading them through labyrinthine passages, each one more suffocating than the last. They reached a door at the end of a narrow hallway. It was old, its wood warped and splintered with age. The faint glow from Lionel's eyes illuminated the darkened space around them, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. Jake hesitated for a moment, his hand resting on the door handle. He wasn't sure what he expected, but whatever lay beyond this door, it wasn't going to be good. He glanced at Lionel again. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, there was a silent understanding between them. "You ready?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lionel didn't respond with words. She simply nodded, her expression unreadable but resolute. With a slow, deliberate motion, Jake turned the handle and pushed the door open. The creaking sound that followed seemed deafening in the stillness. Beyond the door was a room unlike any they had seen before. It was small, its walls lined with strange, glowing symbols that pulsed softly, as if alive. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and upon it was a crystal, glowing with an unnatural light. Jake felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. There was something about that crystal, something that felt wrong. Lionel took a tentative step forward, her eyes locked on the object. "This," she whispered, "this is what they were hiding." Jake's grip tightened on his sidearm again, a wave of dread washing over him. "What is it?" Lionel didn't answer right away, her fingers brushing the air just above the crystal as if she was sensing something beyond the visible. "This is a power source," she said, her voice calm but filled with an edge of caution. "But it's not just any power source. It's something more. Something dangerous." Jake took another step forward, keeping his distance from the pedestal. He didn't trust it. "What's dangerous about it?" Lionel's gaze flickered to him, her expression hardening. "It's not meant to be used by anyone. Not even the Illyrians." Jake's heart raced as he processed her words. He knew enough about alien technology to understand that some things were better left alone. And this? This crystal felt like one of those things. "We need to leave," he said firmly, his voice urgent. "Whatever this is, it's not worth the risk." But as he turned to leave, the ground beneath them suddenly trembled. The faint glow from the crystal intensified, its light now filling the entire room. The symbols on the walls flickered to life, casting long shadows across the space. Jake's heart skipped a beat. They had triggered something. "It's too late," Lionel murmured, her voice a mix of awe and fear. The room was alive with energy, and Jake realized, with a sinking feeling, that they had just uncovered something far bigger than they had anticipated. And now, there was no turning back. The ground trembled beneath Jake's feet as the room's energy surged. The crystal at the center of the pedestal glowed brighter, casting an eerie light across the walls. It was as if the entire room was alive, pulsating with power. The symbols on the walls flickered and shifted, their shapes and patterns moving in ways that didn't make sense to Jake. He glanced at Lionel, who stood frozen, her violet eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. "We need to get out of here," Jake said urgently, his voice steady but laced with a rising tension. He reached for her arm, but she didn't move. Her gaze was fixed on the crystal, her expression far away. "Lionel!" Jake called, shaking her gently. "This is dangerous, we need to leave now." Finally, Lionel blinked, as if waking from a trance. She tore her eyes away from the crystal, her face pale. "Jake, we can't leave." Her voice was strained, and Jake could hear the hesitation in it. "What do you mean?" he asked, his grip tightening on her arm. "That crystal," Lionel's voice faltered for a moment, as though she was trying to understand what was happening. "It's not just power. It's something else. Something, alive." Jake's pulse quickened. Alive? He didn't have time to process her words. He turned his attention back to the glowing crystal. It was almost as if it were calling to them, pulling them in, tempting them with its mystery. "We're not staying here to find out," Jake said, his tone firm. "We're leaving, now." But as he turned to go, the door they had entered through slammed shut with a deafening crash. The sudden noise sent a jolt of fear through him, and he spun around to see that the room had changed. The walls, which had once been bare, were now lined with more symbols, glowing with an unnatural light. The floor beneath them began to rumble, and Jake's instinct screamed at him to move, but it was already too late. "Jake," Lionel's voice was barely a whisper. "They know we're here." Jake's heart skipped a beat. "Who knows we're here?" he demanded, but Lionel didn't answer. Instead, she stepped toward the pedestal, her face pale but determined. This is a doorway. But it's not just any doorway. It's the key." Jake's mind raced. A doorway to where? Lionel didn't look at him as she continued to study the crystal. "A doorway to everything," she said softly. Jake could feel the weight of her words sinking in. Whatever this crystal was, it was far more than he had imagined. It wasn't just a source of power, it was a doorway to something beyond his comprehension. He stepped closer, unable to stop himself. The crystal seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, its light now blinding in its intensity. He could feel it calling to him, beckoning him forward, and for a moment, he understood what Lionel had meant. This wasn't just about survival. It was about something greater, something far more dangerous. But as he reached out to touch the crystal, a sharp, cold wind swept through the room, sending a chill down his spine. The lights flickered, and suddenly, the symbols on the walls shifted, forming a new pattern, one that Jake could almost understand. It was a warning, a message in an ancient language. Lionel stepped back, her eyes wide with fear. "It's not ready," she whispered. "It's not supposed to be opened." But it was too late. The crystal pulsed one last time, and the room around them began to warp, the walls bending and shifting as though the very fabric of reality was unraveling. Jake's stomach dropped as he realized that they had just triggered something far beyond their control. He grabbed Lionel's arm and pulled her back, but it was no use. The air around them grew thick, and the world around them began to blur. "What did we do?" Jake whispered, his voice barely audible over the growing hum of energy. Lionel was silent for a moment, her face a mix of fear and regret. "We've opened the gateway," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And now there's no going back." The room around Jake and Lionel seemed to dissolve into nothingness as the crystal pulsed once more, sending waves of energy crashing through the air. The walls, the floor, and even the air itself rippled, as though reality was bending and twisting in on itself. Jake tried to grab hold of something, anything, to steady himself, but there was nothing to hold on to. The world around them felt like it was collapsing, tearing apart at the seams. He glanced at Lionel, her face pale with fear, her violet eyes wide with a mixture of awe and panic. "What's happening?" Jake's voice barely registered over the deafening hum of the energy that filled the room. Lionel's lips moved, but her voice was drowned out by the increasing intensity of the vibrations. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice strained. "This wasn't supposed to happen. It's opening a rift, something we're not ready for." Jake's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what she meant by rift, but the way she said it, the way the air seemed to warp and distort, made it clear that they were on the edge of something far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. The world around them flickered, and for a moment, everything went dark. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he felt a sharp pull in his chest, like he was being dragged towards something far beyond the walls of the room. It wasn't gravity, it was something else, something he couldn't explain. He reached out instinctively, grabbing for Lionel's hand, but it was like trying to hold on to smoke. The pull intensified, and suddenly, they were no longer in the room at all. The familiar surroundings of the outpost were gone, replaced by an endless expanse of nothing. Jake stumbled, his feet slipping on the nothingness beneath him, but he managed to keep his balance. Lionel's hand was still in his, though she seemed just as disoriented as he was. "Where are we?" Jake gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. Lionel's eyes darted around, but there was nothing to see, no stars, no ground, just a vast, empty void. "This is impossible," she murmured, her voice trembling. "We've crossed through, we're in between dimensions." Jake's mind reeled. Between dimensions? He had no frame of reference for that. Nothing in his experience could explain what was happening. They weren't in a place they could understand, and they weren't in a place they could escape from. The pull was still there, a constant force tugging at them, urging them forward into the void. He looked at Lionel, her expression a mix of fear and concentration. She was trying to focus, trying to make sense of the impossible. "How do we get out of here?" Jake asked, his voice strained with panic. "I don't know," Lionel said, her voice small. This wasn't supposed to happen. The crystal, it wasn't meant to open this way." She paused, her brow furrowing as she looked at him. "It's never been activated like this before. It's pulling us somewhere we don't belong." Jake's heart skipped a beat. Somewhere they didn't belong. That didn't sound like a place they could survive. He tried to focus, trying to calm his mind, but the fear was building inside him. They had no control over what was happening. He glanced around again, the infinite void pressing in on them. But then, something changed. A flicker, a shift in the space around them. For a brief moment, it was as if the nothingness had cracked, and through the crack, Jake could see something. It was faint, distant, but there. A glimmer of light. "Look," Lionel said, her voice urgent now. She tugged at his hand, pulling him toward the light. "There's a way out. We have to move." Without thinking, Jake followed her lead, his feet stumbling as they rushed toward the faint glimmer. The pull was stronger now, as though the rift was closing in around them, and they had to reach that light before it was too late. They ran, though there was no ground beneath them, no sense of direction, just the ever-present force tugging them forward. The light grew brighter, and with every step they took, the air felt less oppressive, the weight of the void less suffocating. Finally, they reached it. The light engulfed them, and for a brief moment, everything went white. When Jake opened his eyes again, he found himself back in the outpost. The walls, the floor, everything was the same as before, but there was no sign of the energy or the rift. The air was still, the tension gone. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. But then he looked at Lionel. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. "We're not safe yet," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Jake frowned, feeling the weight of her words. They had made it back, but something was still wrong. The danger wasn't over. Not yet. The air inside the outpost was thick with tension as Jake and Lionel stood in silence. The light from the crystal had faded, leaving the room still and empty. It felt like the chaos of the rift had never happened, yet Jake could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. Lionel's eyes were wide, her expression distant, as if she was trying to process everything that had just occurred. "It's not over," she whispered, barely audible. Jake turned to her, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do you mean?" he asked. Her gaze flickered toward him, her violet eyes filled with a quiet fear. The crystal, it wasn't just a doorway. It was a beacon. Jake felt a cold chill run down his spine. A beacon for what? Lionel didn't answer right away. Instead, she closed her eyes, as if listening for something beyond their perception. The rift didn't just open a doorway. It called something. Something far more powerful than either of us could have imagined. Jake's mind raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something much larger than themselves. The rift had been only the beginning, and now the crystal was a signal, a beacon that had attracted something, or someone, that they weren't ready to face. He swallowed hard. How do we stop it? Lionel opened her eyes, her face filled with an emotion he couldn't read. We can't stop it, she said, her voice shaking. The only way to stop it is to destroy the crystal. But doing that, it's not just about breaking the object. It's about breaking the connection, the link between the worlds. Jake's stomach turned. Destroying the crystal meant cutting them off from the gateway to everything they had learned, everything they had hoped to find. We can't just destroy it. There has to be another way. Lyanna shook her head slowly. I don't think there is. The silence between them was thick, filled with the weight of their decisions. Jake had never felt so helpless in his life. He had always been able to fight, always had a way out, but now they were trapped in a situation where strength and courage couldn't change anything. It was the kind of power that was beyond their control. So, what now? Jake asked, his voice quieter than before. Lyanna looked at him, her expression softening. Now we wait. And we prepare. Jake didn't like the sound of that, but he knew there was little else they could do. They couldn't outrun what was coming, and they couldn't fight it without knowing what it was. All they had was time. He turned his back to her, his eyes scanning the empty room as he tried to piece together their next move. The outpost was still, its walls silent. Outside, the night stretched on, dark and endless. He could feel the weight of their isolation pressing down on him, but Lyanna's presence was a small comfort. She might be scared, too, but she wasn't showing it. They were in this together, no matter what came next. I'll keep watch, he said after a long pause, his voice firm. You try to figure out what we're dealing with. If we're going to survive this, we need to know what's coming. Lyanna nodded, her expression serious. She stepped toward the pedestal where the crystal had once sat, her eyes narrowed as she began to search for answers. Jake took a deep breath and moved to the door, his hand hovering over the handle as he glanced at the barren landscape outside. The world was quiet now, but he knew that peace wouldn't last. Whatever was coming wasn't going to wait. They couldn't keep hiding forever. As he stepped into the night, Jake's mind raced. He had no idea what lay ahead, but one thing was certain, the next chapter of their journey had already begun, and it was going to be more dangerous than anything they had faced before. The night outside the outpost was unnaturally still, the vast, empty landscape stretching endlessly under a blanket of stars. Jake stood at the entrance, his back to the door, his eyes scanning the horizon. There was nothing, just the same desolate emptiness that had surrounded them since they left the city behind. But despite the silence, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting. He couldn't see it, but it was. As if the air itself was charged with anticipation. The calm before a storm. He turned back to the outpost, glancing at Lyanna, who was still absorbed in her research. She was bent over the pedestal, her fingers moving over the strange symbols, her violet eyes glowing faintly in the low light. Jake could see the strain in her posture, the tension in her shoulders. She had been trying to decipher the alien script for what felt like hours, but there had been no breakthrough. Whatever had triggered the crystal's activation was something they still didn't fully understand. And the longer they stayed here, the more uncertain Jake became. He didn't like waiting. He preferred action, but this was different. Lyanna had warned him that whatever they were dealing with was beyond anything they could have anticipated. They had no choice but to wait. Slowly, Jake walked over to where she was sitting, her focus unbroken. He cleared his throat gently. Any luck? Lyanna didn't look up at first, her fingers still tracing the symbols. Not yet, she replied quietly. But I'm close. I can feel it. Jake knelt beside her, his gaze drawn to the symbols. They were unlike anything he had ever seen. The patterns seemed to shift and change as she touched them, and Jake couldn't help but wonder what they meant. You've been at this for hours, Jake said softly, maybe we should take a break. Whatever this is, it's not something we're going to solve in one night. Lyanna paused, her hand hovering over the pedestal as she glanced up at him. I know. But I can't stop now. There's something here, Jake. Something important. I just need to unlock it. Jake studied her face, the determination in her eyes a sharp contrast to the worry lines that had begun to form on her brow. He knew she was right. If they were going to survive whatever came next, they needed to understand what had triggered the crystal's activation. "All right," Jake said, giving her a reassuring smile. "I'll keep watch. Just, don't push yourself too hard." Lyanna nodded, her lips forming a small, appreciative smile before she turned her attention back to the pedestal. Jake stood, his eyes once again scanning the outside. The stillness of the night was almost oppressive, but he knew better than to trust it. Every instinct he had screamed that something was coming. And they were running out of time. Hours passed, the tension in the air growing thicker with each minute. The only sound was the occasional rustle of papers or the quiet hum of Lyanna's movements as she worked. Jake's eyes flicked to her every now and then, but mostly, he was on edge, waiting for any sign of movement outside. His patience was wearing thin when, at last, Lyanna spoke, her voice soft but urgent. "I think I've got it." Jake turned immediately, crossing the room to her side. Lyanna's eyes were wide with a mix of excitement and apprehension. "What is it?" Jake asked. She took a deep breath, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached for the crystal again. "This crystal, it's not just a power source or a doorway. It's a key. A key to an ancient network. One that connects all of these rifts." Jake's brow furrowed. "Rifts? You mean like the one we just crossed through?" Lyanna nodded. "Yes. And there's more. The rift we opened, it wasn't an accident. It's part of a larger system. This crystal, this doorway, it was meant to open up a link between dimensions." Jake's mind raced. "So, it's not just a way out. It's a way in too." Lyanna's eyes darkened. "Exactly. And the more we try to understand it, the more we're pulling in the wrong kind of attention." Jake's stomach dropped. "What kind of attention?" "The kind that's been waiting for someone to open the door," she said quietly. "We're not just dealing with alien technology. We're dealing with something far older, far more powerful than anything we've ever faced." The weight of her words hung in the air, and for the first time since they had entered the outpost, Jake felt a creeping sense of dread settle over him. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about something much larger. The enemy they had been running from. It was far more than they could have ever imagined. And they had just opened the door for it to come through.